Hello, folks. Thank you for joining us today. We do appreciate your time. Today's presentation is going to be about a half hour, and we'll have QA after. You will communicate with us through the QA in Zoom. People are muted because with any audience of any size, that we can't have people unmuted, but we do want to hear from you. We will have a QA period. We will be answering questions. Thrilled to have Christopher Martin today. He's a professor of digital journalism at the University of Northern Iowa. His research focuses on media coverage of labor and class issues. He's published a couple of books, No Longer Newsworthy, Framed Labor and Corporate Media. He is the president of the United Faculty at University of Northern Iowa and serves on the board of Iowa Public Radio. He is also, of course, the co-author of Media and Culture, Mass Communication in a Digital Age. The 14th edition just came out from Macmillan. I would be happy to send you a sample of Achieve or the ebook or both and answer any questions about that. You'll be getting an email follow-up from me. So if you want that, simply hit me back and I will set you up with access to Media and Culture 14th edition. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris.
All right, thank you very much, Scott. Hello, everyone, and good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. Today, as Scott said, I'm talking about cultural splits and media shifts, the rise of politicized media. Let me just shift a slide here for you. Where we are today is really an interesting and kind of scary situation. There's a lot, and probably this is not news to you, but there's a lot of antipathy towards legacy journalism organizations. It's different than anything we've really encountered in our lifetimes. In other media sectors outside of legacy journalism organizations, there's a lot of disinformation that passes as journalism. And so our students are oftentimes very confused about what's true and what's not. And at the same time, especially in the past several weeks, a lot of press freedoms are being curtailed, and the First Amendment is being sidelined. So it's troubling, and it's as the title of this says, it's very politicized. And to talk about this cultural split in the classroom, and I, just like you, I do that every day. It can be very anxiety inducing because everything you say is so freighted with politics. So at the same time, this is a moment where we are most needed. And it's really our job as educators is to provide the context for understanding how we got into this situation and to give our students the tools to think about it. And that's certainly something that we'll do today. It's a moment where we tell the story about the relationship of the news media and the independent press to our country's political history. And when I talk about the independent press, what I mean here is, for the most part, the legacy mainstream media, which is not affiliated with a political party, which is an important component that I'll explain in just a little bit. But what we're going to try to do is give our students the kind of historical context and critical tools that will help them work through this. And by us leading them to that discovery, they can really kind of own the knowledge and the means to actually make sense of things today, which is which is always our goal as educators. So the events, again, now are part of the cultural splits we're experiencing. And the historical part is what's happening today has its roots in media shifts, changes in the structure of media in the United States starting in the 1950s and 1960s. But before I get to that, I want to go back even further, actually more than 200 years, because that's a really good starting point with students. And if you teach a course that's a survey of the mass media, you'll probably be covering some of that too. But it's good for this topic to go back and actually touch base with that period 200 years ago. So more than 200 years ago, in the colonial era, so even before we had the formation of the United States and into the first decades of the U.S., there were two main types of newspapers. And one, and we don't have these so much anymore, but there are certainly elements of that, is the partisan press. And that's the kind of newspapers that really push the ideology of political groups that subsidize the paper. For example, in the beginnings of this country, we would have Federalist-aligned newspapers, and the other major party at that time was the Democratic Republican Party, and those kinds of newspapers. So those were one kind of newspaper. And the other kind was the commercial press, which served business leaders who were interested in economic issues. And so both of these had a fairly limited audience, although it wasn't even a big country at that time. The on the right or the left there, I should say, is the Aurora General Advertiser, which was a newspaper that was published in Philadelphia by Benjamin Franklin Bosch. He was a Democratic Republican Party supporter and ended up getting jailed by President Adams. So Washington and Adams, our first two presidents, were Federalist. The third president, Thomas Jefferson, was a Democratic Republican. And that becomes important because the Federalists weren't very happy about the criticism from Democratic Republicans like Benjamin Franklin Bosch, who was actually, incidentally, the grandson of Benjamin Franklin, who was a big commercial press editor. Anyway, that was really important 200 years ago because we did have a lot of partisanship in the press, especially in the partisan newspapers. But they were, and this is important to know, very much upfront out about their partisanship. So it's very clear when you picked up a copy of the Aurora General Advertiser that this is indeed a Democratic Republican newspaper, and it's very clear when you picked up, in a Federalist newspaper that that's who was actually supporting that paper. So some similarities, but some differences from where we are today. But there was another shift. So that was really kind of the first type of newspaper structure that we had in the United States. But by the time we got in the era, more of the Jacksonian era, and past the people who were the founders of the country into other generations, by the 1930s, we had another media shift. And this one didn't actually result in so much of a split as instead of resulting more in consensus. So in the 1830s, we had new technology. So we had for the mass production of newspapers with cheap machine-made paper and mechanical presses. We had things like the telegraph coming by the next decade and steam engines. So so news was actually being carried all over the growing country at that time, and telegraph and steam engine trains were collapsing those distances. At the same time as well, we had the rise of middle-class literacy. There were more and more public schools, especially in newer states that were being laid out, and people had more leisure time starting in the 1830s, but very much by the end of the century. So at that time, entering by the mid-1830s is the penny press. Newspapers that for the first time weren't just specialized about business and mercantilism and partisan politics, but really about just regular human interest stories, things that are more recognizable perhaps today in news organizations. And so in that period, we for the first time saw newspapers take not a partisan stance, but saying, oh no, we're actually sponsored by our advertisers, so we don't actually attend to politics, except maybe on our editorial pages, but we're really papers for everyone. And so it was a position for consensus, but it was also a position for growing the base of the newspapers, across parties into everyone, to make them grow as much as possible. So really mass market newspapers, but mass market newspapers that were explicitly not partisan. They said we're not the sponsor of any particular party. And so that kind of newspaper is the newspaper that we're more familiar with that actually extends into the 20th century. So in the first few decades, we get, the New York Times rising as the newspaper of record. That's a cover with Lindbergh from the late 1920s. And then we also see that in radio and TV news. This is Edward R. Murrow, who's interviewing soldiers during World War II. And so that media shift lasts mostly through the 20th century, certainly past the midpoint, and then still even today. But there was something about that. The independent mainstream media, and independent meaning, again, not aligned with any political party, was pretty much centrist in its politics. And it dominated the news storytelling through much of the 20th century and covered a range of views and political thoughts. So there was a lot of ideas, especially if you look at the editorial pages, a lot of ideas and politics that were covered in the news media, particularly in print media, which were the dominant media at that time. But there were some limitations, and both on the left and the right, there was some chafing at the and criticism of centrist, independent mainstream media that they didn't really cover, those perspectives on the far left or far right. And there was some movement on the left and right to establish their own media. On the left, we see independent news weeklies, especially in the 50s and 60s. So things you might recognize like the Village Voice, or the now defunct Boston Phoenix in Boston, and independent news weeklies all across the country. In fact, for many, many years, and if you're, 40 or older, you will remember some of these, especially in college towns and in big cities, there are these independent news weeklies. And that's where a lot of left thinking that wasn't reflected in the centrist mainstream media existed. And so that's where the left went. The right, though, decided to do something very different. And conservatives, who were the far right of the Republican Party at that time in the 50s and 60s, decided to do something different. So they moved against mainstream independent media and began to create their own media system. And we see it as early as the mid-1950s with William F. Buckley and the National Review, which was a specifically conservative magazine and actually took a particular tone as well. And why did they do this? Really for political advantage. One of the things we mentioned, this is a quote from Media and Culture, says, one of the main objectives of this right-wing media, a controversial one to be sure, was to work in counterpoint to the mainstream news media and label it as liberal news in support of the Democratic Party, thus damaging its perceived independence and credibility, the neutrality that was so highly valued by the members of the mainstream press. So there were two things. One is to be, more conservative in your tone, but also to make sure you're a real counterpoint, not to the far left independent news weeklies, which weren't really threatening in any way and weren't aligned with the Democratic Party, but actually took other types of positions. But specifically calling the liberal news media, the mainstream media, the liberal news media, and saying it actually supported the Democratic Party. So kind of drawing a very partisan line there. And fast forward to 60 years later, we actually see that in one quote. I mean, I could pull many of them, but this one was particularly interesting. So in 2016, when Leslie Stahl of 60 Minutes, the CBS program, asked President-elect Trump why he kept hammering at the press, he said, rather candidly, you know why I do it? I do it to discredit you and demean you all so that when you write negative stories about me, no one will believe you. And that was certainly that position again, trying to position the mainstream independent media as media of the left, but also to try to take it down and to have people not actually trust it and support it. And so I'll talk more about that, and we'll look at actually some data on that in just a little bit. But to kind of recap where we are with this cultural split and how did this happen, what you can tell students is that, the conservatives slowly built a separate media sphere. And secondly, they worked to tear down trust in the independent mainstream media. So advance this idea, which goes all the way back to the mid-1950s and National Review, of this idea of the liberal media bias. So that's something, I'm sure you've heard many times in your life these days, but it had kind of a start back in the 1950s and doesn't really become outside of conservative circles, something that's talked about a lot until we get into the 1970s. The Nixon administration was very anti-establishment media and talked about the liberal media bias, Nixon and his vice president, Spiro Agnew. And then we see that start to take off in the 70s and 80s, and then very much so in the 90s, that idea of a liberal media bias. So that becomes a really important thing to get us to where we are today. So I want to talk about those two things. The first one I'll talk about is that building of conservative media. So there's a real infrastructure that the right did, conservatives within the Republican Party, and later it becomes just the entire Republican Party that endorses it, and that the left, for various reasons just didn't do. So I'm going to talk about this because it's important to see the building blocks here. Where we are today wasn't envisioned exactly, back in the 1950s and 60s, but it does build upon each other, and there's clearly a big structure that's been built. So back in the 50s and 60s, it was mostly just specialized conservative magazines, books, Conservatives were actually really good at direct mail at that time as well, in spreading their message around, particularly for campaigns. We don't really get much of a leap beyond that until we get into the 1970s. So one is a really important figure in conservative media. Rupert Murdoch, the Australian, comes to the US and buys the New York Post, a post that actually had its founding way back in the days of Alexander Hamilton, ironically a Federalist. So he owns that newspaper, and it becomes really an important position for spreading his conservative ideals, which he'd already done in Australia, where he first started, and already done in the UK, where he was as well. So Murdoch is really an important figure in spreading conservative in the English-speaking world, and he talks about that and actually identifies himself as a really strong character in that position. The other thing that happens that didn't seem as consequential in the late 1970s, but certainly is now, the establishment of the Christian Broadcasting Network. Pat Robertson established that, later becomes a presidential candidate actually in the Republican Party, and a major player. So that becomes an important stakeholder in cable. Rush Limbaugh, with the demise of the Freedom Doctrine in 1988, with Reagan's FCC, spreads conservatism on talk radio across the country. Up until that point, if you were to do partisan talk radio, you had to give the other point of view. And you had to be open to that because of the doctrine by the FCC. But with the demise of that, that allows for conservative talk radio to really take off across the country. And there's really nothing that is the left equivalent of that in terms of radio. Matt Drudge and the Drudge Report in 1994, and that site still looks pretty much the same as it did then, but an important foothold on the internet. Rupert Murdoch comes back to establish Fox News, which was kind of a dream of the Nixon administration in the 1970s to have cable news that would be for conservatives. And then other things that we get in the more digital world. Breitbart as one of the early places in the internet in 2007. Two other cable/streaming networks, OAN and Newsmax. And then social media, Truth Social, which Donald Trump established in 2022 after he was kicked off of Twitter. And then Twitter becomes X when Elon Musk buys it, and is actually very much kind of in the bag for Trumpism and MAGAism these days. So it's really been transformed quite extensively. So that becomes that first big media shift to change the actual infrastructure and to build a separate media sphere. The other part of that was to actually change the discourse. And we talked about this a little bit, but media scholars Kathleen Hall Jamieson and Joseph Capella at the University of Pennsylvania, have been following this for years. And actually almost 20 years ago, they wrote, these conservative voices portrayed themselves as the reliable, trustworthy alternative to mainstream media, while at the same time attacking liberals and dismissing or reframing information that undercut conservative leaders or causes. And that really talks very accurately about the change in discourse that you see in conservative media. There's a photo a year before he died of Rush Limbaugh receiving the presidential award from Donald Trump at that time. So the other part in changing the discourse, some of the tools that were used that we talk about in media and culture are information anarchy, which is definitely what Donald Trump told 60 Minutes to get people to not believe what's true and to question, mainstream independent media like 60 Minutes. Bias confirmation, which is to tell people news that seems to make sense to them. So especially if you're of a certain political bent, to give people news that seems to confirm that news, and to get rid of or not include that news in the conservative media if it doesn't go with your bias. And then finally, false equivalency, which is it's both a defensive and offensive approach to defend what you're saying by saying, well, they're doing the same thing, or to do something and say it's just like what the other side is doing. So those are kind of things that are very common in the discourse, and actually have given us a discourse that's not always truthful, and definitely always supportive of a certain political point of view. So the result is, again, we have this cultural split of today. And I want to look at a couple screens here, some studies that have been done, I think both by Pew, that give us the result of the cultural splits and show us what that looks like visually. So this is a chart that the Pew does actually every year. This is as of last year, all the way from 72 through 2024. But every year they ask about Americans' trust in media, whether they do it a great deal, a fair amount, or not very much, or none at all. And what you see from the peaks of a great deal or fair amount of trust in the media, it was about 68% in 1972 and peaked out at 72% in 1976. It's just a decline down from that point on. So if you look at that top line on the left, the green one, it goes all the way down to 31% of Americans now think a great deal or a fair amount of trust in the mass media. Meanwhile, not very much is still kind of stuck in the middle, and none at all has actually increased. So basically, Americans do not trust the media. About a third of them give it some trust, a middle third not very much, and another third not at all. So that is, it's not a recipe for consensus, that's for sure. The other thing that I want to talk about in terms of the two separate media spheres. So Americans, again, there's this mistrust, this information anarchy, don't believe in the media, but people do believe in certain types of media. And so what we see are Republicans and Democrats and independents kind of going back and forth, differing in terms of the major news outlets that they track. And so Republicans are much more likely than Democrats to say Fox News and Talks Radio are at least minor sources of election news for them. And this doesn't break down as much as I'd like. It's the percentage who follow each of these as major or minor sources of election news. So could be major or minor, but Republicans, as you might expect, would be more of that sphere that is conservative media, Fox News and Talk Radio. Democrats are much more likely than Republicans to get their election news from all other news outlets mentioned in the survey. And what you find, and I don't have a slide here for it, but what you do find is that Democrats and independents or others who tend to, and there's some Republicans, who tend to get their election news and political news from a number of different news outlets that are independent of partisan media, they tend to know more and tend to be more open-minded about things because they've heard a range of ideas. And certainly that's a goal of the independent mainstream media, to present a range of ideas. You won't get that in more partisan media and in the conservative media. So there's a number of surveys that actually show that in terms of knowledge, what you do know and don't know. So I don't want to leave you, with that just kind of depressing. I don't know where we're going with this. We're just going to be in this cultural split for the next era. But I want to give you some ideas for healing the cultural splits and thinking about, how do we rebuild democracy? How do we, and also how do we work with students to get them to understand where we're at and get them to be critical of and understanding of what's going on here. So. And my answer is it's education. It's what we do. We are uniquely suited to take this on as educators. So that question, how do we talk about the news media and their role in culture, is one that seems kind of scary and anxiety inducing these days. And I can tell you as someone who used to teach in Ohio, where I know there's a number of laws in circulation right now, and as someone who teaches in Iowa, different state in the Midwest, still four letters, but it's also a state where people are actually very concerned, and there's bills in the state legislature to crack down on even talking about some of this. So, and I talk to my students about that because they should know, they don't want me or you to talk about this. But what we should talk about, there's definitely two things. One, we have to correctly define the problem for them, and to say that we now have two media spheres. And it didn't look like this maybe a couple decades ago, and oftentimes the conservative media were kind of denying this, just saying, oh no, we just have different, we're just mainstream, but we're bringing different news to you. It's very clear to say we have two different media spheres. One is politically independent and mostly centrist. And I would say, it's important to say centrist. I wouldn't say the mainstream media is not political. It's just that they're centrist. And sometimes in America, we kind of interpret centrist as being neutral. But it's mostly centrist in terms of how it approaches politics, both the Democratic and Republican politics. And we have another media sphere that's closely linked to a political party and very conservative. And that's just the way it is right now, and that's the media that we have. And actually, if you look at other countries, there's a number of other countries that are moving in that same direction, if not already in that kind of definition of their media. So, secondly, we need to tell our students there's been a concerted effort to undermine independent news media in the US and elsewhere. And you can certainly build a conservative media or a liberal media in any country, but it's another thing to actually um, make a concerted effort to undermine the media and to confuse people and to actually do, what we call information anarchy in the textbooks. So, and they have to be aware. So that's why I like to tell them about this history. They need to understand, like, hey, this is what's happened, and you should know that. The other thing that we need to tell our students is give them the tools to evaluate the news on the basis of truth and verification and not political bias. And there's been a lot of criticism of news is that, oh, that's biased, and I won't get into it unless you want to talk about it afterwards. But there's actually a number of services that give you certain diagrams and figures talking about here's media on the left, here's media on the right, here's media in the center, and I'm pretty skeptical of those, and I don't think they're asking and answering the right questions, because I think you can actually have a political point of view and still at the same time be following, professional guidelines on truth and verification. So it's when you don't follow the guidelines on truth and verification that get you into problems. So how do we go about doing this? There's 5 points I'm going to make here. First, recognize confirmation bias. Tell your students about that and tell them a lot of what's out there in social media, in news media, and conservative media appeals to them and plays to their confirmation bias. And oftentimes you get yourself into trouble, for example, in social media, forwarding things very quickly because it seems like it's right to you, because it appeals to your sense of how the world is, and it confirms your biases. So let students know about that. Second, call out false equivalencies, and you can do that in some of the tools I'm going to suggest in just a little bit. These false equivalencies aren't based in fact, but rather, again, political stances to say, oh, it's just like that or it's just like that. Oftentimes comparing things that shouldn't be compared and that aren't really equivalent. And so we need to actually call those out and actually use real facts to verify these things. Thirdly, there are professional standards and codes of ethics for legitimate journalism. And I like to have students look at things like the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics to kind of get a sense like this is what real news should be doing. This is how you should be reporting the news. These are the things you should be transparent about. Students should know that and understand those things, because there's a lot of organizations that profess to be news that don't do that sort of stuff. Fourthly, recognize our field, I mean people who are scholars in mass communication or media or journalism, our field's longstanding criticisms of mainstream media. So on one hand, I'm defending mainstream independent media because I like the fact that they're not aligned with a political party and that they have professional standards. At the same time, they don't always do a good job. In fact, as Scott mentioned at the beginning, I do research and write books about how the news media, the mainstream media, do a really terrible job of covering the working class and labor. By that, I'm not seeking the destruction of fact-based journalism. I don't want to destroy CBS News or ABC or NPR, the New York Times, but I'm asking for it in certain instances to do better. And you might think about your research. If you do research and that kind of research, you're looking for better journalism. And I think that says to students like, we're not trying to we're defending actual journalism as a concept. We're not trying to defend individual shortcomings. And in fact, here are some shortcomings. So it's okay to do that. Finally, I want to recommend a case study form, Is It Fake News, that we actually have in Media and Culture. And this is what it looks like. And I'll give you a closer look at the form in just a minute. But we have 15 questions and allow students to actually, get some kind of news. It could be an article online in print. It could even be, something posted on TikTok or Reels. And so the worksheet covers 3 areas: fake presentation. So what's the credibility of the news organization? Secondly, fake or misleading claims. What's the validity of the claims? And there's 5 different tests there. Is what they're saying valid or not? And then thirdly, misleading by design. What's the ethics or purpose of that news organization and this story? And a lot of them, it's actually it is designed to be misleading, and those are things that would call disinformation. Those are things that are misleading by design. Here's what the form looks a little bit like up close. So again, fake presentation. Does the story provide reporter bylines and bios? And that's usually a pretty quick yes or no on a lot of organizations. And if they're hiding bylines and bios, it's is it even a real person behind it, or is it sometimes there's some organizations called pink slime journalism, not by the organizations themselves, but by their critics that just use algorithms and throw together kind of a fake looking newspaper online. Is the site transparent about news organization's address, telephone numbers, email address? Does the site provide a link or email address to report corrections or errors? Those are some of the things you're going to be looking about. How credible is that news organization? On the validity of claims, we're going to be looking for verification by doing original reporting. A lot of lame news sites will actually just recite or something else, or pull something off the internet and say this is true because it's been on the internet. And those are things you need to be wary of. You can take a whole look at that in the book. So I recommend that. We pulled, in putting this together, a number of different news organizations and journalism organizations that are trying to do media literacy and criticism of the news, and try to take the best of that and adding in some of what we felt was lacking in this one sheet, is it fake news form. So I think it's really helpful. And one final thing I want to say about this before I wrap up. I I don't think this is going to feel like a partisan project for you to take a sheet like this and actually criticize the news. I think students need to know the questions to ask because it's so confusing for them. And interestingly enough, there was another Pew study, one from 2021, that found both Democrats and Republicans, the highest factor rated in deciding whether a news story is trustworthy were these two things: the news organization that publishes the story, and we just talked about that's an important thing, deciding whether a news story is trustworthy, and then secondly, the sources cited in the story. So those are criteria that are really important, and even Republicans and Democrats tend to agree that these are things we should look at. So if your students think you're doing something very partisan, say, look, no, people agree on this, and what we're trying to do is take a really fact-based approach to this. We're not looking at the politics, and in fact, something could be political and still could have like really good fact checking and verification and take a point of view. That's fine, but we want to get rid of the stuff that actually is not factual and is trying to deceive us. So I'll stop right there and be happy to take some questions, though.
Thank you so much, Chris. Appreciate it. And thank you all for coming today. We've already got a couple of questions in the QA. Continue to submit them. We've got a few minutes here, so we'll answer as many as we can. We will stop if it gets to the hour. We will stop there. The first question that we got, I'm going to take them in the order we got them. This seems the fairest way to do it. How much of the antipathy towards, sorry, I know the word, I just don't know how to pronounce it, towards legacy media journalism today is due to the shift back, in parentheses, toward advocacy journalism, especially the partisan press, and away from objectivity in that industry? My university essentially teaches advocacy journalism, no longer embracing SPJ principles. Has this development eroded the trust consumers have towards establishment journalism?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I would say two things. One is this idea of liberal bias. At the same time we have a very conservative media. It's been very effective in making people think like, oh, you can't be partisan in any way. I think there's a number of different news organizations that do advocacy journalism. At the same time, they actually hew to the standards, of the SBJ or other organizations. So they verify facts. They're transparent in how they report. And in fact, any good, if you can think of like an opinion piece that might be in the New York Times, for example. Any good opinion piece will also do their due diligence in terms of making sure the facts check out in what they're arguing. If the facts don't check out, I think that's a problem. But I don't think it's necessarily if you do advocacy journalism, it's necessarily journalism that's not true. I think we've been told to think that way. And it's been a way to kind of tear down the mainstream press. But I'll give you an example. I mean, I think even like independent news weeklies, the old papers like the Village Voice or the Boston Phoenix again, and they're very much on the decline. But if we take a newer news organization, actually one that's been around a long time, that's been on the left, like The Nation, or something that's on the right, like the Bulwark, I think you can actually have a point of view and do advocacy journalism, but still actually hew to the standards of verification. So I think that's a really good question. I think it's when you don't hew to those standards. So I could say, on the right, Breitbart, it certainly has a partisan advocacy. But if you look at their stuff, there's a lot of stuff that's not true there. And other people who've done studies of Breitbart have kind of borne that out. So I don't think it's just the advocacy. I think there's been a lot of beating down of mainstream independent media. And that's why I try to focus more on let's look at the facts here and make that be the judge and not be partisan. Because remember, the mainstream stuff is centrist in its politics too. You can never get rid of politics, and there's always going to be some shortcomings with that politics. Let's not try to tell people that we can actually be, completely neutral. I don't think that's true.
Thank you. Next question. Give me a moment to pull it up. We've got a couple to choose from here. Chris, how did the advance of distrust reflect the Soviet/Putin approach to destabilize the people's grasp on facts and reality?
Yeah, I think you could certainly see it in the former Soviet Union. You can see it in the Putin now. I've spent a lot of time in Hungary and lived there for a half year back in 2013 when that was happening. I mentioned Hungary because it's kind of a model for some people on the right about how the press can work for a political party in power. And I think it's we've seen a lot of things. What certainly the information anarchy, like telling people and putting out lots of disinformation and having them be unsure about what to believe. And we have a lot of that. I see that in my students. I see students kind of hesitant to believe too much and actually feel more like seeing is believing. So unfortunately, they sometimes will think that everything on TikTok is true because they saw it. In the world of AI, that is not a good indicator of truthfulness. But I think there's been a long, decades and decades of trying to tear down mainstream journalism. We're pretty advanced along in that in the United States now. It's very advanced in, certainly in Russia and in Hungary, along with other things. I mean, actually jailing and killing of journalists, and there's a long history of that, and we've talked about that in the textbook as well. But also something that actually concerns me is oligarchs buying out independent media and then just oligarchs aligned with a leader and then actually making that news organization more friendly. And we saw that happen with a number of independent news organizations in Hungary, where Orban's rich friends would buy a news organization and then just kind of flip it and make it, an organization that was friendly to the government. We saw that happen, I think, arguably with Twitter in the United States, and we're seeing at least pressure being put on a number of news organizations in the United States, including the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, CBS News, and others. So when the FCC is being used to investigate almost every news organization on television except Fox News, it doesn't seem to pass the smell test. So good question.
Thank you. Next question. It seems that even how one defines independent or centrist vary among consumers and scholars. Therefore, the discussion about undermining is also fraught with differences in perspective. Thoughts on approaching that conversation in the classroom?
That's a good point. I didn't cite it in this presentation, but because I wasn't sure exactly what to do with it, but Pew has done a couple of studies, and actually they're really good for, getting surveys on how people think about the media. But they did a couple surveys in the past couple years about um, what people define as mainstream media, which is really a funny question. And it varies. There's a number of people, Republicans included, who think, for example, that Fox is included in the mainstream media. There's a number of people who are Republicans who specifically talk about the mainstream media and exclude Fox from that. Like that's in another sphere. Like the mainstream media is the bad liberal media we're trying to talk about. So it's interesting. That might be an interesting way to kind of talk to students about that, saying like we don't even agree what's mainstream media anymore. But I think you can actually talk about relatively centrist mainstream media. And by that I mean the centrist media, but mainstream is it can be defined in so many different ways. So I think you can just say, look, we can't even decide exactly what's what in terms of the media, but historically we can look at how these different spheres arrived. The way we talk about them is unclear, and I that may be by design, I think. Yeah, it's interesting to think about that. Is mainstream a measure of popularity, or does it mean you're part of the centrist liberal media? And some people, can't agree on that. But I think that lack of agreement might be a good way to start with students, saying like, what do these mean? And then try to dig into it. Say, what does this really mean? And where does this come from?
Thank you. Next question. Why has the left not developed a media system or media like the talk shows, things like this? I'm assuming
Yeah,
similar to the right in America
that's a
has
really
done.
good question. Again, like the right started doing that in the 1950s, and kept building it up. There was a lot of support on the right. A lot of people with deep pockets decided to do that. I think people on the left didn't feel quite as that they needed, and they certainly got critiqued by, I mean, there's lots of criticism along the way think about presidents, President Carter, President Clinton, President Obama, and other Democratic administrations certainly got their criticism from the centrist mainstream media. But they never felt like they needed to do something different, I guess. There is some talk now among some people, some writers saying that we should just build, a media on the left, just like they do on the right. And I think that's an interesting question to give to students too, because it would be interesting to think about what would America look like if we had, the conservative media on the right that we have, a similar type of media on the left, for far left positions, and then a maybe shrinking centrist mainstream media in the middle. What would that look like? Would that be better in terms of our operating as a democracy, or worse? And it would be helpful to look back at the partisan press and how deeply felt those disagreements were in terms of actually even jailing people at that time, more than 200 years ago. The left, it's an interesting question. The left just never did that. In talk radio, for example, there was an attempt at building out something called Air America in the 1990s. It's where people like Rachel Maddow got her start, and some other people that you might recognize. But it kind of withered away, and it's debated even among academics, like in that one in particular, like how that happened. MSNBC was actually conservative for a while. It's actually swung more to the left, although it's kind of mixed in terms of its people, and so there's people who've come and gone. But I wouldn't argue that one's completely to the left, but there have been some efforts to do that with cable stations. But there are more left cable stations that just never caught on. So it's a really interesting question.
Okay, we have one more. If people want to submit while Chris is answering this, we have time for more. If not, this will be our last question. And again, we thank you for your time. You'll get an email with a follow-up and a recording of this, and you'll be able to, if you need any exam copies, desk copies, things like that, you can just hit me right back and I'll make sure that you get it. So the last one that we have for now is how much history do you cover in your intro mass comm class? I'm assuming
Okay.
that's because they got it early on, because of the historical coverage I think you were talking
Yeah.
about.
Yeah, good question. Actually, one thing I wanted to answer on the other question, the other thing on the lack of left media is that it's never been a priority for the Democratic Party, which is another, which I neglected to mention, but that's been a big thing and it wasn't an issue on the right. How much history? I talk in more detail about certainly about the rise of journalism in the United States and how that went. So that's an important thing. But I think that the history, and that's something that we're trying to get trying to add actually in recent years was much more history on the rise of conservative media, and I think that's important. I think there are other textbooks that didn't want to talk about that because it's touchy because it seems like you're being political, and our argument has always been like, but it's the truth and the reality. Like we really can't talk about where we are in the media today unless we talk about all the media and how they develop. So that I think that's a really important thing to talk about. So I do talk about that in depth, and I find students very receptive to it. I mean, again, it seems sometimes kind of scary to talk about these political things in classes, and sometimes you might feel that pressure from your own university. But I think to talk about it and stick to the facts, I think that's an important thing that people need to know. And it's just how things developed. I mean, it might seem more bipartisan if we could talk about, yes, and there's a left media that developed the same way, but that just didn't happen. So we have to talk about how we got here and why we're this way today.
We do have one other, it sort of a question, sort of a comment. Oh, and we have something else that came in as well. Uh,
Mhm.
Tom Hartman talks about the need to buy radio stations, which the right did, but the left, by and large, did not. And I guess he had put a question mark at the end of it. Any comment on the purchasing of radio stations by partisan
Yeah,
um,
I think so.
concerns?
I think that's that's certainly a way if the left wants to build that out, that's certainly something that can happen. Stephen King, the author, actually owns some radio stations in Maine and around New England that he wanted to keep independent, but he's selling those off as well, and that's just kind of like a small thing. But it's hard to do. A lot of the stations are expensive. Most of the big clear channels on AM have long been conservative talk radio, and I can see in some ways it's a good business. Just like Fox News, which is actually a big money maker. I mean, you have a built-in audience for that. Um, it's not clear how big the audience on the left was because I think people on the left are by and large, even though they complain about it, audience members of kind of centrist media. So a lot of people on the left, and it's actually accused of being so, if they're listening to radio, would oftentimes listen to NPR and NPR affiliates, which isn't left. I would say again, it's actually pretty centrist in many ways. But it satisfies, but it people. I think that satisfies much of what people want on the left. Although people on the far left are actually dissatisfied, and there's lots of complaints about. I know people who are much more to the left than me and say like can't stand listening to NPR. It's much too conservative. So, but that's a start. It would take decades and decades to build out, if you were to do that, to build out something equivalent to what's conservative in terms of that media sphere. So but it's certainly something that's possible.
We have one other question that came in. How did naming independent media as woke impact the division?
Yeah, I think that's just it's another way of saying, what people started to say on the right, that, the liberal bias on the left. I think woke is just another way of saying that. It's interesting because in both of those, the name just kind of stands and is kind of in some ways kind of a slur or smear. Oftentimes, the people who say that don't have to define what they mean by liberal, or what does that mean exactly, or what does woke mean exactly. And some people will push back and say, well, woke just means you're open-minded about people, you're careful and observant about people's individual rights and recognizing them as fellow citizens. So So it's always a good question to respond by saying, what do you mean by that? But it's clear what's meant by that, on the right. It's a way to suggest that the media that are in the mainstream or anywhere to the left of conservative media are woke and political, and in doing so, it means that they're not following any kind of professional standards, and it also means that they're allied with the Democratic Party, although they clearly are not. But it gives that suggestion, so it allows conservative media to say, like, we're just giving you an alternative view to what the woke media or the liberal media is giving you. So it's kind of clever in the way it sets up that discourse, but it doesn't really bear out to the truth of things about most media just being centrist.
We have reached the end of our questions. Thank you all for submitting them. Thank you for being here. Be sending you the recording, and we're here to help you out with whatever requests you may have. Chris, thank you so much. This was great. I really appreciate you doing this, and
Thanks,
hope
everyone. Yeah, it's my pleasure.
take care, folks. Bye.